Hey folks, friends, people. you know, this is a little essay. I don't even know how little it is. I don't know how long this is. This could be a very long reading, actually. But it's an essay by Marcel van der Linden. It's titled, Did Castoriadis Suppress a Letter from Pannekoek? A note on the debate regarding the, quote, organizational question, end quote, in the 1950s. Here we go. Council communism derives from an undercurrent of international communism that became more widely known mainly thanks to being labeled by Lenin as a, quote, growing pain, end quote. Council communism, a term that appears to have been in use since 1921, arose from the defeat of the German Revolution of 1919 to 1920 and has existed in several versions. The most radical one was primarily a Dutch creation. The Group of International Communists, the GIC, formed in 1926, took Marx's statement that the working class should liberate itself to mean precisely that and therefore rejected altogether any direct interference from intellectuals and other non-proletarians in the class struggle. By far the most renowned proponent of this view was the astronomer Anton Pannekoek, who lived from 1873 to 1960. Footnote. The GIC view appears to have been devised by the teacher Henk Kana Meyer. Meyer. I think that's how you would say that. It's weird when you see a name that you've read a bunch of times and never had to say out loud. Who lived from 1890 to 1962. Pannekoek's, quote, conversion, end quote, to the GIC, on Pannekoek. Oh, that's just a source. Okay. Sorry about that. Back to the text. The GICers were the, quote, monks of Marxism, end quote, to quote Henk Snevliet, who was, if you've been listening to any of the videos on Trotskyism, was a prominent Dutch Trotskyist. They published journals and organized discussion meetings, but they never tried to take charge in incidents concerning the workers' struggle. The GIC resolved the, quote, organizational question, end quote, which socialists had debated ad infinitum, by denying it. The workers would come up with their own solution once the time was right. In 1972, Jaap Kloosterman published in a meticulously prepared edition of selected writings by Pannekoek. In his critique in the postscript, he argued that the, quote, scientific socialism, end quote, of Pannekoek and his kindred spirits was, quote, a pseudo-theory of the proletarian revolution based on ideological awareness of the bourgeois, end quote. The GIC was therefore not the start of a new type of labor movement that it believed it was, but the, quote, latest version of the old labor movement, at a time when the consumer society was extending its control of the economy to cover all of everyday life, end quote. Once the true new labor movement based on workers' councils came to fruition, its, quote, ultimate implementation of the revolutionary core of Marx's theory, end quote, would irrevocably coincide with the, quote, demise of Marxism, end quote. Their radical economism had led the council communists to, quote, deeply underestimate the intrinsic organization idea, so that the activism of the old movement was not overcome but was transformed into inactivism, end quote. Exactly what the new style activism advocated by Jaap would entail remains unclear here. As will be explained below, however, his critique of Pannekoek relates to a more long-standing, quote, tradition, end quote, of radical leftist critiques of Dutch council communism. I will illustrate this based on a specific example. Jaap's theses include clear references to the work of the French theoretician, writer, and filmmaker Guy Debord, who lived from 1931 to 1994, whose ideas in turn derive from French revolutionary socialist circles of the 1950s. Jaap knew Debord personally, corresponded with him, and together with his friend René van de Kratz, produced a Dutch translation of Debord's magnum opus, La Société du Spectacle. Well, I don't know if I'm saying that right, but Society of the Spectacle, you know what the fuck I'm saying. When Jaap's, quote, Thessen ad Pannekoek, end quote, was published, Debord, by his own admission, knew little about Dutch council communism, but the theses corresponded with the theoretical perspective that the French philosopher devised. Debord's perspective was the outcome of many dialogues and confrontations with other radicals, including members of the group Socialisme ou Barbarie, of which he was briefly a member in 1960 to 61. In the 1950s, Socialisme ou Barbarie had gradually drifted away from Marxism because its structured ideas blocked a, quote, open, end quote, interpretation of historical and political processes. At the same time, the group engaged in lengthy debates about the, quote, organizational question, end quote. It can hardly have been a coincidence that Socialisme ou Barbarie, in the course of these debates, also came into contact with the Dutch council communists, who had joined forces with former adherents of the aforementioned Snevliet in the Spartacus Bund back in 1944. I will introduce both groups in a bit more detail. Socialisme ou Barbarie, which existed from 1949 to 1967, is certainly one of the most interesting organizations emerging from the 20th century radical left. The, quote, social barbarians, end quote, as they were sometimes known, were never very numerous. At their peak, they may have comprised 100 predominantly male members, and editions of their journal sold about 1,000 copies. But Socialisme ou Barbarie was also an exceptional forum, of which the participants over time included countless highly vocal intellectuals. The first that merits mention is the now world-renowned Cornelius Castoriadis, alias Pierre Jaloux, who lived from 1922 to 1997, the philosopher, economist, and psychoanalyst of Greek heritage, who was an important force in the debates from the outset of the organization until its dissolution. Another influential member was the co-founder and philosopher Claude Lefort, alias Montal. Montal and the Jaloux-Montal tendency, for those who don't know, was a tendency within the Trotskyist Fourth International before Castoriadis and Lefort left Trotskyism. And Lefort became known mainly for his ideas about democracy and human rights. Other intellectuals who figured in the group interactions for brief or extended periods during the 1950s were internationally acclaimed thanks to their publications, included the psychoanalyst Jean Laplanche, who lived from 1924 to 2012 and was a member of Socialisme ou Barbarie from 1949 to 1950, the sociologist Benno Sternberg, alias Sorel, Sarel, who was born with a question mark to 1971 and was a member of Socialisme ou Barbarie from 1949 to 1967. The literary theoretician Gérard Genet, who was born in 1930 and was a member of Société ou Barbarie from 1957 to 58. As well as the inventor of postmodernism, the philosopher Jean-François Lyotard. This unlikely concentration of intellectual talent, combined with input from militant employees such as Jacques Gautrat, alias Daniel Motet, born in 1924 and was a member from 1952 to 1962, turned Société ou Barbarie into a laboratory for radical ideas. Although the group definitively disbanded in 1967, it nonetheless inspired part of the protest movement during the May Rebellion in Paris the next year. It says in a footnote that this influence is clearly visible in Daniel and Gabriel Cohn-Bendit's obsolete leftism, or whatever is obsolete communism. It's in French. The translations and the words that's in the essay are in French, but the book that I know by them is called Obsolete Communism. I think it's called, with the subtitle like Left-Wing Alternatives or something like that. The influence of Société ou Barbarie was never a paragon of unity. Group members expressed divergent views on many subjects, instigating major controversies time and again. Sometimes this led individuals to leave the organization. Occasionally, a small group would embark on a joint new effort. The most important rift in Société ou Barbarie occurred in September 1958, 4 months after the coup by the Colons and the army in Algeria, with former General de Gaulle advancing as the, quote, strongman and, quote, in France. The discernible trends towards more repressive government intervention gave rise to strategic debates within Société ou Barbarie, as well as in many other political forums. The, quote, social barbarians, end quote, proved deeply divided on the question as to whether the time had come for a new revolutionary party, and especially what the optimal balance was between spontaneity and organization. The arguments advanced during the debate on that topic were fundamental and surfaced directly and indirectly in the protest movements later on. Some of these debates in the 1950s included outsiders as well, 2 Dutch council communists from the Spartacus group who were on good terms with Société ou Barbarie. They published their interpretations of events at several, quote, letters from France, end quote, in the Journal of the Spartacus Bund, which was edited by Caillou Brendel and Theo Maassen. End footnote. The question about the balance between spontaneity and organization was far from new to the Dutch. Within the Council Communist movement, in which the GIC had been a kind of outlier, debates about this issue had been ongoing since the 1920s, and the positions adopted covered a broad spectrum. At one extreme were those strongly in favor of a council democracy promoted by revolutionary vanguard, while at the other extreme were the proponents of non-intervention in the class conflict based on the principle that the working class should be entirely responsible for its own liberation. They regarded the, quote, old, end quote, labor movement, trade unions, labor parties of whatever political affiliation as totally obsolete, and believed that a, quote, new, end quote, labor movement was emerging based on autonomous activity. To my knowledge, the vanguard party position did not surface as exactly that within Spartacus in the 1950s, although most members favored promoting the class struggle actively through propaganda and solidarity. A minority within Spartacus supported non-intervention, including the 2 members maintaining contact with Société ou Barbarie, Theo Maassen, who lived from 1891 to 1974, and Caillou Brendel, who lived from 1915 to 2007. Both had previously belonged to the non-interventionist GIC in the 1930s, although Maassen had been excluded from the organization back then. Spartacus members had followed the rise of Socialisme Barbarie from the outset. As early as 1949 to 50, they published an excerpt of the principal statement by the French revolutionaries in their own journal. Only in 1952, however, did they get in touch with each other. In September of that year, Spartacus wrote to the French, briefly introducing the group and announcing its national conference on the 25th to 26th October. The letter continued, quote, "If you could possibly have one or a few comrades attend this discussion, we would be delighted," end quote. Sorry, I'm looking at the footnotes to see if there's anything that needs to be said. Sorry. This invitation was immediately accepted. Socialisme Barbarie dispatched René Carlet, alias Neuville, or Neuville, I'm not sure, whose immense satisfaction with the meeting led him to propose another gathering. The context then intensified. Spartacus members, especially Caillou Brendel, henceforth made regular trips to Paris. Let me see if I'm pronouncing his name right, Move this phone off the keyboard.
Caillou Brendel. Caillou Brendel.
No, I'm saying it wrong. Caillou Brendel.
Caillou Brendel. Caillou Brendel.
They said it's German. A German name when the Germans say Caillou.
Caillou Brendel.
Caillou Brendel. Alright. I'm saying it wrong. It's not Brendel, it's Brendel. The context then intensified. Spartacus members, especially Caillou Brendel, henceforth made regular trips to Paris with, quote, social barbarians, while, quote, social barbarians, end quote, visited Amsterdam occasionally as well, such as on Whitsun in 1954 when a delegation of 5 arrived. At that point, considerable criticism had arisen within Spartacus of the majority view expressed in Socialisme Barbarie coming from Cornelius Castoriadis and his kindred spirits. In the autumn of 1954, one member, presumably Brendel, noted that, quote, over this past summer, the long-standing deep-seated differences between the majority of the French group and Spartacus have become more pronounced, while a minority within the French group, which does not embrace the party's stand, has, on the other hand, moved closer to Spartacus, end quote. He attributed this to the, quote, massive strikes held in France in August 1953, end quote. The adherents of Spartacus did not quite know how to respond to theoretical criticism from an intellectual of Castoriadis' stature, as the organization consisted mainly of blue and white-collar workers without a university education. But they did have their own eminence grandis, Anton Pannekoek. Footnote. Brendel believed, quote, The worker element is far better represented in our group. Yes, they have even admitted to me that workers are and virtually absent from their organization end bracket. The ones who are not students or intellectuals are still white-collar workers and officials in corporate industry. 2 are office workers at Renault, and 1 runs the office at some large metal factory near Paris. I have met 1 comrade among them who works for an insurance company. End quote. I think it might have been Henri Zimon who worked for the insurance company, but I can't be sure about that, so don't quote me on it. On the 8th of November, 1953, In the autumn of 1953, Pannekoek received a complete set of all previously published issues of Société Barbarie from Brendel, and thus had cause to put in writing his well-intentioned critique of the movement behind Castoriadis. On the 8th of November 1953, Pannekoek, by then 80 years old, wrote the French that while he sympathized with their group in many respects, his view differed from theirs on 2 essential points: the assessment of the Russian Revolution of 1917 and the matter of the vanguard party. Unlike Société Barbarie, Pannekoek did not consider this Russian Revolution to be a proletarian uprising that had later degenerated to a bureaucratic state capitalism. He was more inclined to regard the revolution from the outset as a bourgeois effort that could never have given rise to a socialist society. Pannekoek adamantly rejected the idea of a vanguard party. In his view, revolutionaries should not form a party but should stick to disseminating propaganda and interfering in theoretical debates. Their task was not to, quote, lead, end quote, the struggle for liberation. Their sole mission was to launch a universal appeal for control for workers. Société Barbarie published Pannekoek's letter together with a response from Castoriadis. In this reply, Castoriadis focused on the question of the vanguard organization. In his view, revolutionaries who did not form a party should pave the way toward a bureaucratic dictatorship such as the Soviet Union. Quote, in fact, the only, quote, safeguard, end quote, against such an error is to apply the idea in practice, just as the only, quote, safeguard, end quote, against bureaucratization is to engage permanently in anti-bureaucratic action and to demonstrate that a non-bureaucratic organization of the avant-garde is possible in practice, end quote, Castoriadis. Pannekoek later clarified aspects of his view in a second letter dated the 15th of June 1954. This one was not published in Société Barbarie. In 1971, Caillou Brendel argued that this was because that letter displeased Castoriadis and he had therefore suppressed it. At the start of the present century, this accusation was repeated in a slightly different wording by Henri Simon, a former member of Société Barbarie. The allegation seemed unfounded from the outset because Société Barbarie did run a response from Theo Masson on the same subject at a later date. Proper refutation was impossible in the 1970s, and thereafter, however, because Castoriadis could by then no longer recall the, quote, circumstances under which this letter was not published, end quote. 2 documents that Pannekoek has left us definitively prove that the accusation is untenable. The first document is a letter from Castoriadis to Pannekoek from the 22nd of August 1954 announcing the publication of Pannekoek's second letter in Société Barbarie. This letter also mentions a third letter from Pannekoek, dated the 10th of August 1954, which I have so far been unable to locate. The other document is a draft version of a fourth letter from Pannekoek to Castoriadis, dated the 3rd of September 1953, in which Pannekoek writes that this second letter was, quote, not written with great care, end quote, and was not intended for publication. He also reiterates the essential difference of opinion with Castoriadis, thereby clarifying the view that Jaap's Thesen ad Pannekoek countered over 40 years ago. And it seems as that is the end of the essay portion, and now there is a letter from Castoriadis to Pannekoek. Let me see what's going on here. Okay. And we'll read that. Okay. This is a letter to Castoriadis. No, to Pannekoek from Castoriadis. From the 22nd of August 1954. Dear Comrade Pannekoek, I apologize for the delay in replying to your letter of 15th of June. I was not in Paris and wanted to reply to your letter only after discussing it with the comrades of our group. In the meantime, I have also received your letter of the 10th of August, including the article in Marxist, quote, ethics, end quote, which we have discussed as well. As far as your letter of 15th of June is concerned, we have agreed unanimously to publish it in the upcoming issue of Socialisme ou Barbarie. It will certainly help readers understand your point of view better, both regarding the question of the party and that of the nature of the Russian Revolution. As for myself, I do not personally think I need to add anything of importance to what I wrote in issue 14. Please let me share with you alone that I had never thought that, quote, we could overcome the Communist Party by copying its methods, end quote, and that I've always said that the working class or its avant-garde requires a new method of organization that meets the needs of the fight against bureaucracy, not merely the realized external bureaucracy, that of the Communist Party, but also the potential internal bureaucracy. I say the working class needs an organization before forming councils. You respond, it does not need a Stalinist type of organization. We agree, but your thesis requires that you show that a Stalinist type of organization is the only organization attainable. I think, moreover, that advancing in this area of the discussion will be difficult. I intend to take up the question again based on the text Intellectuels et Ouvriers, or Ouvrier, published in issue 14 of Socialisme ou Barbarie, and I hope to be able to publish an article on the subject in issue 16. I even believe that at that point we will be able to resume the discussion more fruitfully. With fraternal greetings, Pierre Chaloux. P.S. Due to a misunderstanding, you believe that there is an error in the translation of your letter. The expression bracket, which leads literally, end bracket, all we need is to form a revolutionary party, end quote, is a French wording that in fact means, quote, we cannot help ourselves with a revolutionary party, end quote. This translation closely approximates your English expression, quote, we have no use for, end quote. That's the end of that letter. And then here's a draft reply from Pannekoek to Castoriadis from the 3rd of September 1954. Dear Comrade Chaloux, thanks for your letter of August 22nd. As to the other question, crossed out, point, my letter of June 15th, in writing it, it was not my intention that it should be printed, or rather, it was my idea that it would not be printed, so that I have the feeling that it was not written with great care. If, however, you think that some of its parts may clarify the ideas, then I advise to select and print these parts only, in order that my remarks shall not occupy too much space. I have the impression that the exposure of my ideas in my, quote, workers' councils, end quote, may give a broader and more general basis. I will send you a reprint of one of its chapters, which lately has been prepared and published by our English friends of the ILP. So the Independent Labor Party. Footnote. The British this is a reprint of Chapter 6, Section 2 of there's a pamphlet, I guess, published called The Way to Workers' Councils, published in London in 1953. This is a reprint of Chapter 6, Section 2 of Pannekoek's Workers' Councils. The British Independent Labour Party, founded in 1893, was a small leftist socialist organization which until 1932 had figured within the Labour Party and went off on its own until it rejoined the Labour Party in the 1970s and was transformed into a lobby group. If you were curious, and I'm going to assume that you are curious, is that the Independent Labour Party, I think, was part of I think they sided with the so-called rightist opposition around Bukharin in the Soviet Union, and one of their most famous members was George Orwell, who went to Spain during the Spanish Civil War as a correspondent for the Independent Labour Party. And once he was there, he was so impressed by the revolution that was going on there, the working class revolution, that he felt that he could not just be a reporter, but had to actually be a combatant, and joined the local right opposition group. I believe they were a right opposition group, the Party of Marxist Unification, although they might have been a synthesis of certain right opposition and left opposition people, but there was a distinct left opposition Trotskyist group within the Spanish Revolution called, I think they were called like the Bolshevik-Leninist Party. So the Independent Labor Party actually has sounds like an obscure thing, but it actually has a very big historical relevance to the history of conceiving working class democracy or socialist democracy. So yeah, that's a side note. I don't know why I had to throw that footnote in there. I feel like that would be the main thing that people know the Independent Labour Party, British Independent Labour Party, for. So come on, Van der Linden, get it together. Just kidding. Don't get it together. There is something abrupt in it. No, sorry. This is back to the letter from Pannekoek to Castoriadis. There's something abrupt in it, since the arguments are based on the former chapters that here are lacking. But, they, Independent Labour Party comrades, apparently had the idea that just for the passive unrevolutionary English workers, a little bit of discussion may be a healthy stuff. I have the impression that we stand at opposite extremes of opinion about proletarian class action. By each emphasizing one of its sides, always the fact appears that some persons stand out in activity, in courage or in clearness of vision, in speech or in rapidity of action. These persons together constitute an actual avant-garde, which we see appear in every action. They become factual leaders. They may incite the activity of the masses, and by their broader view can give good advice in the actions. When they combine into fixed groups or parties with established programs, these fluid relations become petrified. Then as leaders, ex officio, they feel themselves responsible and wish to be followed and obeyed. At the other side, we see that in all massal or revolutionary actions there appears a deep common feeling, not merely conscious as shown by the fluctuations in taking part in the action, but based on very real conditions, securing the unity of action needed for positive results. Here the leading personalities become unimportant accidentals. The real and lasting gain of progress of society consists in what the total class, the working masses, change in their inner character, acquiring independence, defiance, losing their servility. This takes place only by their own activity and initiative, not by following others. Between these 2 points of view, the practice of the class struggle may take all its grades of intermediate or combined forms. There may still be made a remark on massal action. Looking at the present life conditions in our Western countries, it may seem, and is widely accepted, that such massal actions even more become impossible and unnecessary. Impossible because of the enormously increased power and violence of the governments backed by big capital. If an industrial region should be in the hands of the workers, one atom bomb may destroy it. Unnecessary because working and living conditions, as well as political rights for the working class, become ever better and more secured. Yet we are certain that the threat of capitalism is heavier and more dangerous than ever before. Now world war is its most important form. The impending destruction and misery of mankind threatens the entire population, intellectuals and tradespeople as well as workers, though the latter form the most numerous part. So massal actions will be necessary more than in the past, and they lose their strict class character such as they had in the past in Belgium and Russia. They are the only way in which the masses of the peoples may exhibit their will in what constitutes their life interest. Yet you never find them mentioned neither in political discussions and papers, nor in socialist reviews. Is it the fear to be identified with Russian communism, or more generally the fear of all leading groups for the working masses taking action themselves? The end.